peoples under colonial and racist regimes and foreign occupation, or could deprive them of the right to obtain support for others in these ends in accord with the Charter of the United Nations. That was the offending paragraph. And it's easy to understand why. It raised a serious problem for the United States and Israel. The African National Congress was identified officially as a terrorist organization in the United States, and South Africa was officially an ally. But the phrase struggle against colonial and racist regimes plainly referred to the struggle of the ANC against the apartheid regime, so that's unacceptable. The phrase foreign occupation, everyone understood, referred to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, then in its 20th year, extremely harsh and brutal from the beginning, continuing only because of decisive U.S. Military, economic, and diplomatic support, which runs up to the present. So obviously that was unacceptable. So therefore, the vote was 153 to 2 with one abstention. So it wasn't totally unanimous. It wasn't reported, and it's disappeared from history. You can check to find out. Incidentally, that's standard practice. When the master says something is wrong, it's down the memory hole. Doesn't get reported, and it's forgotten. But it's there. If you want to look, you can discover it. I'll give you the sources if you like. Reagan at that time was, recall, he and Paris were talking about the evil scourge of terrorism in the Middle East. George Shultz didn't entirely agree. He thought that what he called the most alarming manifestation of state-sponsored terrorism was frighteningly close to home. Namely, it was a cancer in our landmass, a cancer right nearby that was threatening to conquer the hemisphere with a revolution without borders. Rather interesting propaganda fabrication, revealed to be a fraud instantly, but always used repeatedly afterwards, even by the same journals who explained why it was total fabrication. It was just too useful to abandon. And there's also an interesting, if you think about it, the fabrication had a certain element of truth in it, an important element of truth. Could come back to that if you like. Anyhow, this cancer in our landmass was threatening to conquer everything, openly following Hitler's Mein Kampf, and we plainly had to do something about that. It was a serious. There's a day in the United States called Law Day. Elsewhere in the world, it's called May Day, May 1st, a day for support of the struggles of American workers for an 8-hour day. But in the United States, it's a jingoist holiday called Law Day. And on Law Day 1985, President Reagan declared a national emergency because the government of Nicaragua constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. That was renewed annually. George Shultz informed Congress that we must cut the Nicaraguan cancer out, and not by gentle means. Things are too serious for that. So to quote Shultz, recall the administration moderate, the good cop. Quote Shultz, he said, negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not cast across the bargaining table. He condemned those who advocate utopian legalistic means like outside mediation, the United Nations, the World Court, while ignoring the power element of the equation. I'll avoid quoting the hardliners. At that time, the United States was exercising the power element of the equation with mercenary forces based in Honduras, attacking Nicaragua. They were under the supervision of John Negroponte, who was just appointed to run the diplomatic side of the diplomatic component of the current war on terror as a UN ambassador. The military component of the current war on terror is Donald Rumsfeld, who at that time was Ronald Reagan's special envoy to the Middle East, the other place where the plague was raging through 1985, in fact. The United States at that time was also blocking utopian legalistic means that were being pursued by the World Court, the Latin American countries, and others, and it continued to block those means right to the end until the final victory of its terrorist wars throughout Central America. Well, how was the war against state-sponsored terrorism waged in those two regions by the people who, in fact, are leading the new phase? So it's pretty close historical continuity, not just those two, of course. Well, let's just, to illustrate, pick the peak year, the worst year, 1985 in the Middle East, top story of the year. So what were the, who wins the prize for the worst acts of terrorism in the Middle East in 1985? Well, I know of three candidates. Maybe you can suggest a different one. One candidate is a car bombing in Beirut in 1985. The car bombing was placed outside a mosque. The bomb was timed to go off when people were leaving to make sure you kill the maximum number of people. It, according to the Washington Post, killed 80 people, wounded over 250, mostly women and girls leaving the mosque, but it was a huge explosion, so it blew up the whole street, killed babies and beds and so on and so forth. The bomb was aimed at a Muslim sheikh who escaped. It was set off by the CIA in collaboration with British intelligence and Saudi intelligence, and specifically authorized by William Casey, according to Bob Woodward's History of Casey and the CIA. So that's a clear-cut example of international terrorism, very unambiguous, and I think it's one of the candidates for the prize for the peak year of 1985. Another candidate surely would be the so-called Iron Fist operations that Shimon Peres's government was carrying out in occupied southern Lebanon in March of 1985. The operations, this is southern Lebanon, which was under military occupation in violation of a Security Council order to leave, but with U.S. authorization, so this is irrelevant. The bombing, the Iron Fist operations were targeting what the High Command called terrorist villagers in southern Lebanon. Included many massacres, lots of atrocities, kidnapping of people for interrogation and taking them to Israel and so on. It reached new depths of calculated brutality and arbitrary murder, according to a Western diplomat familiar with the region who was observing. There was no pretense of self-defense. Rather, it was openly undertaken for political ends. It was conceded, it wasn't even argued. So that's a clear case of international terrorism, although here we might claim that say that it's aggression. I'll call it just international terrorism, in line with the principle that we bend over backwards to give the United States the benefit of the doubt. Of course, this is a U.S. operation. Israel does it because they're given arms and aid and diplomatic support by the United States. So we'll decide to call this just international terrorism, not the much more serious war crime of aggression. The same, incidentally, was true of the much worse operations of 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, killed maybe 20,000 or so people. Again, crucial U.S. military and economic and diplomatic support. The U.S. had to veto a couple of Security Council resolutions to keep the slaughter going, provided the arms for it, and so on. So it's a U.S.-Israeli invasion, if we're honest. The goal of the invasion, I'll just quote the New York Times on that, the goal was to install a friendly regime in Lebanon and oust the PLO, which would help persuade Palestinians to accept Israeli rule in the West Bank and Gaza. That's actually accurate, and I have to compliment the New York Times in saying that. That was this January 24th. As far as I know, that's the first time in mainstream U.S. literature that anyone has dared to say what was absolutely common knowledge in Israel and in the dissident literature 20 years ago. I mean, I was writing this in 1983, just using Israeli sources. But it couldn't penetrate U.S. commentary. You might check and see. As far as I know, this is the first breakthrough. I'm not sure the reporter understood what he was saying. But anyway, he did say it. James Bennett, January 24th. Well, prize for James Bennett for telling the truth after 20 years. And it's true. And, of course, it's a textbook illustration, virtually textbook illustration of international terrorism. This time we have to bend over backwards pretty far to call it international terrorism because it's hard to say why this isn't overt aggression, the kind of action for which U.S. and Israeli leaders should be subjected to Nuremberg trials, real serious war crime. But again, let's keep to the guidelines and say it's only international terrorism. Well, that's the second example. This 85, I'll keep to the Iron Fist operations. Third, the only other example for 1985 that I know of took place a few days before Shimon Peres arrived in Washington to join Reagan in denouncing the evil scourge of terrorism. Shortly before that, Peres sent the Israeli Air Force to bomb Tunis, killing 75 people, civilians, torn to shreds with smart bombs. It was all rather accurately and graphically depicted by a highly respected Israeli reporter, Amnon Kapeliuk, in the Hebrew press in Israel, and corroborated by other sources. So the United States cooperated with that by withdrawing the Sixth Fleet, so they didn't have to inform their ally Tunisia that the bombers were on their way, presumably getting refueled on the way. So that's a third candidate. I don't know of any other candidates that even come close to being candidates for. Incidentally, George Shultz, the moderate, immediately after the bombing, he telephoned the Israeli foreign minister to say that the United States had considerable sympathy for this operation, but he backed away from open support for massive international terrorism or maybe aggression when the Security Council unanimously condemned the attack as an act of armed aggression, the United States abstaining. I didn't want to vote against that. So those are the three cases top three cases that win the prize for 1985, to my knowledge. And again, I'll assume that these are just international terrorism, so we're not calling for Nuremberg trials. Just more international terrorism by depraved opponents of civilization itself, and examples which are pretty hard to miss, remember, because this was the peak story of the year, international terrorism in the Middle East. Here's three perfect examples, in fact, the only three major examples that I know of. However, they aren't candidates. In fact, they're not even in the running. They're not competitors. The examples that are in the running are, for example, cited in the current history issue to which I referred, which does discuss 1985 and gives two examples of the evil scourge of terrorism, namely the hijacking of TWA 897, killing one American Navy diver, and the hijacking of the Achille Lauro, the boat, which led to the killing of Leon Klinghoffer, a crippled American, both surely terrorist atrocities. Those are the two examples that are in the running that are memorable, that count for international terrorism. Well, the hijackers of the TWA plane